What are some traits of creative people?
Openness, drive, tolerance of ambiguity.
What are some methods or techniques to enhance creativity?
Perseverance, practice, self belief.
What's the simplest technique to enhance creativity?
Daily practice.
How do you assess creativity in animals?
Ooh. In animals, you'd look at anything that involves novel problem solving, novelty, or something different from their usual repertoire.
Okay, next question. It's going to be a little bit personal, so I apologize. Would you take psychedelics to enhance your creativity?
Yes.
Okay. Can AI ever be creative as we are creative?
Can be creative, but not as we are.
Do you ever encounter ESP or parapsychology in your work on creativity?
I was at a parapsychology conference last week. Yes.
Wow, that's very astounding to admit on.
Well, it was a meeting of neuroscientists and parapsychologists in Portugal.
Okay, okay. Well, we will have to come back and talk about that. And finally, what are the dangers of creativity?
The danger is because it's about reaching your potential, you may not care whether it's for the good of the world or not. It's for you.
Welcome to Closer to Truth. I'm speaking with Anna Abraham, creativity expert and author of the fascinating new book, The Creative Brain: Myths and Truths. She explores 7 myths, which we'll be discussing, and relationships between creativity and various kinds of myths, such as right brain structure, madness, intelligence, psychedelics, and more. Welcome, Anna. I'm looking forward to our discussion. But before we really dig in, a quick question to begin. In researching and writing your book, what was your biggest surprise? Did you have any aha moment of insight?
Well, several, 7 of them, in fact, which was that perhaps the thing that we were getting wrong was to try and call something a myth or a truth, when actually there's a little element of truth in every single myth that we explore about the creative brain.
Mm-hmm. And why did you structure the book around myths? Why was that the organizing framework?
Primarily because it's kind of the question I get asked the most when I'm delivering talks, when people approach me, when they find out that I'm a creativity researcher. They always have a set of assumptions about what the creative mind is or what the creative brain is.
Mm.
And it didn't seem to really matter what I said about, no, this isn't true, or this is not quite this way. It just seemed to be resistant to any kind of change. And I was interested in that. Why do we choose to believe something? And even despite an expert telling you that that's not all there is, just find it really hard to reframe it. So partly I was thinking, are we interested in the story being told a particular way? And what makes our minds so resistant to uh, changing our minds once we get a hold of a story and we kind of like the story and the way it flows?
Yeah, I love the structure of the book done that way, and in all cases, you find this, as you call it, a kernel of truth at the heart of each myth, which gives it, in general, the reason for its persistence. But the principle really goes beyond creativity. It goes, everything from our belief systems to conspiracy theories. Dealing with things like confirmation bias. We look for things that we want to confirm our interests. I think there's a deeper truth there about how the human mind is structured. It's not just about creativity with a myth. It really applies to all of our belief systems.
I agree, and I think that was perhaps one of the surprises as well that came with it, is that there's nothing, we're not applying our minds differently when we think about creativity. It's really just the way we think about the world, and
Mm.
we have a sense of saying there are two types of people, or there's this way and that way of looking at it, and it
Right,
seeps
right.
into the way we just see the world, the way we perceive things, and make sense of the world.
Mm. Okay, well, let's get into the book. But before we do, I need to give a more formal bio because you have great credentials. Anna Abraham is professor of educational psychology and director of the Torrance Center for Creativity and Talent Development at the University of Georgia. The center is dedicated to nurturing and developing creative potential, which is present in all individuals across the lifespan. She was also the editor of the Cambridge Elements in Creativity and Imagination series. So, Anna, we're going to go through each of the 7 chapters, and I want for each one to begin with a very simple structure to give orientation, and that is, what's the myth? Uh, Stated very simply, it's often simplistic. What's the truth? And that's often complex, but explain that very, very briefly. And then what are the potential implications? What follows from that? And then we'll get into some detail. So we'll start with the creative right brain. We've all been exposed to that. I've certainly in my neuroscience career heard it over and over again, that, the right brain is creativity and the left brain is analytics, and the two compete with each other, and all sorts of theories have been devised from it. So that's the myth. What's the truth?
The truth is that from the earliest proponents on have never emphasizes that the right brain is the sole seat of creativity. They have always emphasized that both hemispheres are involved. It's just turned into a myth because the right hemisphere was ignored until that point. And so when someone said, hey, stop ignoring the right hemisphere, it's important for functions of a creative nature and otherwise, suddenly it became touted as the only part of the brain that's involved in creativity.
Mm. And the right brain is the artistic, the musical, the big picture, the visionary, and the left brain does the critical analysis and the details. I mean, that's the simplistic version of it. And just so everybody remembers, there's a cross lateralization. So the left brain controls our right side of the body, and generally the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. So some very interesting things. So let's get into some detail about the right brain. I know you alluded to the neurosurgeon Joseph Bogan in some of the early work that he did and that Roger Sperry did at Caltech. Bogan, by the way, was on Closer to Truth in our one of our early season. I think it was 2003. So that was people can see that on the Closer to Truth website. So describe that situation with the corpus callosum, why they did it, and what we began to learn from that.
Yeah, so I think it was very significant that Joseph Bogan was part of the original team, really, that brought particular types of patients with specific types of lesions to the brain, which was essentially a chiassotomy, where this essentially is a severance of the corpus callosum, which meant that the left brain and the right brain were not communicating in quite the same manner as before, because the major tract that connects them, it's not the only tract, but it's the major one that does, was severed for clinical reasons. Typically, it was people suffering from intractable epilepsy, and this was kind of the only way in which to stop those epileptic seizures and enable patients to have a relatively normal life. And that was perhaps one of the most astounding things, was that they seemed pretty unchanged by this really quite major neurosurgical operation. And Sperry and his team of fellow scholars, neurologists, and so on, had to devise some really interesting experiments to try and really figure out the subtleties of what the right brain does and what the left brain does. And so Joseph Bogan was part of the team who brought, I think, patients 0 and 1 to the attention of the Sperry team, and was the one who pushed for looking for a lot of the behavioral and functional, as far as I can follow the literature, of I can make out. So he played a central role there, and that actually had a huge impact on the way this information was received. And he began to notice that at the time, of course, there was a lot of emphasis on left brain operations,
Mhm.
because it was very clear the left hemisphere had a unique role in very essential language functions, the mere production of language, the comprehension of language, and so on. And again, it also became notable for its extra role in intentional movement. So like you started off saying, each hemisphere um, essentially controls the contralateral side of the body. But when it comes to intentional movement, the left hemisphere plays an added role there, in that it also controls intentional movement of the left side of the body. That was really subtle experiments that came out with that. So it seemed to be that the left hemisphere was more important, and it fit with all of what was happening in the zeitgeist of the time, which was this real focus on logical reasoning, what's good for us. And language has always been seen as kind of the epitome of human function in many ways. And so the left brain became accorded this kind of, what would I say, almost a sacred position
Mhm.
in the way we think about the mind. And of course, there are other things that our mind does, and sort of started being the right brain started to get relegated. All of the things that were less desirable, So it became sort of the civilized mind versus the manic, um, zany mind. And so the
Mhm.
left hemisphere is the civilized, control, logical, and so on, and everything else, the opposites on the right side. This was done very intentionally throughout, and there's a lot of literature that I cite throughout that chapter to say that many of these assumptions were based on just assuming an opposite rather than finding any evidence for whatever you have, uncontrollable desires, passions, and so on for the right hemisphere. But Bogan came along and then pointed out, again, not much in the way of evidence, but suddenly I have a great appreciation for scientists of the time. They had to go on what little they had. We have so much available to us, and we find it hard to make sense of what's there. They had so little to go on, and they obviously had to go beyond what the data suggested. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. And he was the one who essentially pointed out that the right brain actually is really more important for so many aspects of humanity that get that are just as important: the emotional range of our experience, complexity, a sense of self, and creativity with it. And so he was very open about, I think, his the obviously hypothetical nature of his ideas. But when he saw that a lot of nonverbal types of behaviors were really sort of operationalized by the right hemisphere, that gave him a lot of credence for his ideas. And in the literature that looks at the left brain, right brain myths, they make a case for how this kind of fit with the spirit of the times. When you think about all of the political unrest that was happening, the sociological changes that were taking place, this need to think about, the civilized world versus, the controlling world,
Mhm.
everything that controls the apparatus of the world, and the ones that are trying to break against, it kind of fit with the narrative. And so when he came out with these ideas, there was and of course there was all this exciting stuff happening in the case of the left brain and the left brain functions. There was a sort of what do they call, a sprint brain mania. I wasn't alive at the time to see it, but from what the accounts say, the it's kind of like the psychedelics mania we have now, where people are constantly focusing on, anything in relation to AI. Any news in relation to that is grabs the attention of the press and the general public. That was the case with all of the split brain studies there. So it became very
Right.
quick, kind of had rock star status in the
Right.
public.
I'm old enough to remember it very clearly.
Yeah. So what they call dichotomania, and so a lot of things when it comes to thinking control versus freedom, that was essentially the dichotomy that was being proposed there. The left brain is about control, the right brain is about freedom. So you could accord anything to that, and
Mhm.
people could come out with, all sorts of tricks and trades and medicines and behavioral interventions, all sorts of things to train up your poor right brain, which is being controlled by the left and needs to be unleashed in order for you to be creative and so on.
Right. You conclude that the type of very specific allocation of creativity only to the right brain, you say, is simply untenable. So, what are some of the research findings more recently that make that original concept that you're talking about obsolete?
I mean, we can start with Bogan himself. He himself in the 80s pointed out that when we're thinking about the creative process, it is always a temporally extended phenomenon. And he himself talked about, when you think about the different stages of creative ideation, when you talk about the preparatory phase, let's say compared to the incubation phase, the illumination phase, and the verification phase, he said that the left hemisphere was really important in certain aspects of these phases. So in the preparation phase, for sure, and certainly in the verification phase. And he made a case for really kind of a dance between the two hemispheres, depending on which aspect of the phase that you're in.
Mm.
A lot of neuroscientific work in the meantime has shown us that there's really just not enough evidence to make a simple case for the right brain as the creative brain. It really matters what kind of task you're looking at, whether what kind of population you're looking at. Are you looking at normative creativity in the general population? Are you looking at extreme cases? Are you looking at people trying to come up with a visual image compared to something written? It depends on what kind of creative cognitive operation you're trying to isolate. So very much creativity has become more like a field like memory has, because if you think what's the brain basis of memory, you could say, well, it's the hippocampus. But if you have to really break it down, you're like, well, that's a really, really simple way to look at it. If you really break it down to the different types of memories, the different systems, the implicit explicit systems within those systems, all of the subsystems, huge expanses of the brain are involved depending on what you're looking at. And that's the kind of understanding we've come to even in creativity research.
So you talk about three strategies that we can adopt to develop a more accurate, more nuanced understanding about the hemispheric specialization in the context of creativity. You said there are three potential approaches. One is to clear the conceptual confusion, to distinguish between assertions of experimental derived asymmetries from those that are philosophically motivated. A second was a strategy to widen one's focus outside the context of creativity, and that there was a similar latent functionality present in brain hemispheres that's drawn upon when needed. And so it was just, and the third alternative was to collate and contrast different ideas of hemispheric specialization. So, I mean, these are just to give a sense of the way to approach the problem dealing with the experimental data, to try to develop a conceptual framework to organize the experimental data as a way of thinking. In other words, not just the experimental data, but what are the sort of the model theoretical approaches to unify them?
Well, there's a range of things one could do. One is to distinguish between theoretically driven assertions about the left and right brain, that may be philosophical in nature, that may sort of come from some data, but it's not really proved by the data, let's say, that might be motivated by it. And to distinguish those from the really empirical aspects of what the data are telling you, and whether that really has any direct it serves as a direct proof. We need to then also break it down. The second thing you can do is get really, really specific, like what I said earlier, in terms of thinking about whether it's related to specific domains, whether it's related to specific types of modalities, and so on. So to be really specific about when we see it, where do we see it? And the third thing is to perhaps again, when we start from there, to really just go beyond the data to think, if this is true, what would we expect as the next step? What would we expect that would we expect would be necessary in terms of the left brain, right brain, what we would assume is the case based on the data we've seen. So so far, when we look at the left brain, left brain, we just find anything that seems to show a little bit of the right hemisphere and think, oh, it's proof of it. But it really needs to be systematically addressed to say, let's look at competing hypotheses. Even in terms of the left brain, right brain hypothesis, there are competing views about what exactly the right brain is doing. So Elkanon Goldberg has a different theory compared to Mark Beeman. These are the researchers who have active left brain, right brain theories. And so we need to devise studies that test those theories very specifically to say, it's not just that this is the right brain, but what is the right brain doing?
Yeah, one piece of data that I thought was very interesting in your work dealing with functional neuroimaging showed that the right hemisphere in musicians, focusing on musicians who are comparatively inexperienced at improvisation, the right brain had more dominance, which fit the zeitgeist metaphor, as you said. However, when they looked at musicians who were highly experienced in improvisation, primarily the left brain was involved. And this suggests that possibly that creativity is a right brain ability when dealing with an unfamiliar situation, but that creativity draws on well learned left hemisphere routines when a person is experienced at that task. And so
Yes.
that is a really interesting piece of data. Assuming it's correct, we always have the replicability problem, but assuming that's correct, that's really interesting.
Yeah, but they asked a specific question and they looked at specific context, and so it came up with a really meaningful result. And that's what we need to see when we're thinking about the left brain and the right brain and their, you know, how they interact. Because of course, for most of us, our callosum is intact, and our left brain and right brain are always talking to each other,
Sure.
and that's the thing we need to really not lose sight of.
Yeah. People have used the left brain, right brain in some, very large metaphors or ways of thinking about the world. Yeah, literally, kind of dividing the entire world, Western world culture. Ian McGilchrist, famously, the master and his emissary, writes a very, brilliant and literate way of thinking about Western culture as the left brain takes over from the right brain and things like that. How justified is that in terms of the complexity of the science?
I think it's looking at the question from a different plane of analysis. So if you think about what is your micro level of analysis, if I'm an empiricist studying left brain, right brain functions, in particular creativity task, my micro level of analysis is really, really local.
Yeah.
And I think haven't had the fortune to speak to Ian McGilchrist yet, but from what I know of his work, it's a very big picture kind of approach. And I don't think you could realistically put them two together, except to say that we're explaining very different things. And I think a lot of the work on the left brain, right brain, persistence of the myth, there are people in the literature who say, actually, it's useful to think about, to have this myth in place.
Mm.
Because to have this idea that the right brain is the seat of creativity and other freedom related aspects of our human expression, because it serves as a metaphor for much deeper things, and metaphors are really powerful. And I think what he has there is a really useful metaphor to convey quite simply, quite very, very complex ideas across. And that's a reason why the creative right brain metaphor meme, if you want,
Yeah.
will never disappear, because it serves a really useful role in society as a metaphor. And so it'll always stay there. And it's fine to have it there for as long as people don't make the mistaken idea, take the mistaken then a generalization from there, that is actually the concrete way in which the brain operates. That's just not true.
You conclude by saying that creativity in terms of hemispheric lateralization is a stupendously complex picture. And that word very much typifies the structure. And it's not that we don't understand. To understand the complexity at that level gives you a very rich feeling of what creativity is from a neuroanatomical and neurofunctional analysis.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right, let's go on to chapter 2, madness and creativity. So very quickly, what's the myth?
The myth is that madness, mental illness, is positively associated with creativity.
And the truth?
That's not quite true. And there is a link, but it's very tenuous, and we're not sure about the cause and effect. It's a chicken and egg syndrome, it's a situation of we don't know what came first and how they are related. So even in situations and specific conditions where they are related, we don't know why and how they're related.
All right, so let's discuss it, and then that will determine the implications and what follows from it. So when we're associating madness and creativity, there are really two ways to look at it that we know that there are creative people, composers, writers, artists, and so we can look at that group and say, how many are mad? Mad meaning mental illness. There are a lot of definitions of mad, which you have a nice section on. I'm mad about her, or I'm mad at her. There are a lot of different mads, but we're talking about the mental illness kind of mad. So we look at creative people and how many of them are mad. And then we can do the reverse and look at the cohort of mad people and ask about their creativity. So those are two very different kinds of approaches. So, what kind of patterns exist when you do both, either of those or both of those kinds of analyses?
Yeah, so I think the definitive work that sort of shows that there is some link comes from these birth registry studies from Scandinavia. There's it's huge. They have databases there that essentially link from the time you're born till you pass everything that is of relevance to you, from the medical data, educational data, how you're connected to the people in your life, your parents' educational data, their medical metrics, and so on and so forth. So Simon Kyaga started this work and has done several studies. And what he looked at was, if you have, the second part of what you said, if you have a mental illness, are you more likely to be in a creative profession? And what he found was that it really is the case. It really matters what kind of mental illness we're talking about. And in the case of, let's say, schizophrenia, what he found was you were not more likely to be in a creative profession if you suffered from the disorder yourself, but all of your first degree relatives were more likely to be your
Yeah,
parents,
that's
parents, siblings, your
fascinating.
children, so on and so forth. If you had bipolar disorder, you were more likely to be in a creative profession. And this was also true of all of your first degree relatives. And the third case in the first study that he did, I think, was unipolar depression, and he found that there was very little evidence there to say that if you suffered from major depression, that you were going to be in a creative profession, or your first degree relatives were going to be in one. So this was the kind of work to say, well, okay, there is a link. It's really specific to specific disorders. And then a lot of his additional work has shown, for instance, that certain types of creative professions are more at risk. So writers, for instance, are more at risk for all sorts of disorders, including substance abuse, much more likely to be suicidal, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So that fits really well with several older pieces of literature that were perhaps less scientifically rigorous because of the times they were in, but certainly seemed to suggest that there was an increased propensity in on the other side of things, on very acclaimed creative professionals, there was a higher than average propensity to be associated with mental illness. So
Mm.
that it corresponds with that. But he didn't look at extremely eminent people. He just looked at if you had a disorder, were you more likely to be, and that kind of fit in there. The other pieces of evidence come from looking at people who are if you look, you could study, for instance, people with specific mental disorders. I've done those studies and look at how they perform on creative cognition tasks. And again, this shows a very mixed picture. It depends on the disorder. It depends on the type of task. So if you break it down into certain types of creative cognition tasks, as I have, there are certain aspects of creative cognition in which certain types of I wouldn't say mental illness necessarily, but certain types of insufficiencies could be an advantage. So for instance, if I, in my own studies on children with ADHD, if you they and gave them a sort of whole battery of creative cognition tasks, they weren't really better on any task except one compared to their matched neurotypical controls. They were really good at overcoming a salient example. Now, when I ask you to create something new, let's say come up with a new toy. This is a famous toy task. Come up with you're working for a toy company. Come up with a new toy that no one's invented before and doesn't exist currently. And participants always like, okay, I'm not really sure what's involved here. And and unbeknownst to them, you pretend and show them something. You say, well, I'm going to show you examples that other people of new toys that other people generate. And unbeknownst to them, these examples you show them have some things in common. They always have a presence of three elements: a ball, physical activity, electronics, and so on. And then you look at a person in terms of when they generate something, how many of these elements that they've seen before do they bring into their own invention? So you look at the constraining influence of salient information. So it's almost
Mm.
like the opposite of a working memory task. In a working memory task, you have to keep information in mind, salient information in mind in service of a goal. Here you have to block salient information in service of a goal. And what we find is that patients with basal ganglia lesions, children with ADHD, people with schizotypal traits, all are better at this task. Not any
Mm.
of the other aspects necessarily of creative cognition. That depends on the population question, but that. and can be linked to their executive function impairments, insufficiencies. That if you're really distractible, one thing that you're good at is not being focused on a salient example. You can
Right.
be more
Right.
distractible. And so in a task where distractibility serves you positively, you're going to be better at it.
Yeah, that
So
makes sense.
that makes sense. So it demands what population, what task, and so on.
The first degree relatives to me was a fascinating area,
Yeah.
because simplistically, when I looked at that, what it said to me was that some of these traits are beneficial at a certain level. And so, therefore, there were two assumptions here. One is that mental illness has some genetic component, which I think is now well accepted. And so, people who have a mild degree of that same kind of activity, which in a great degree generated the overt mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar. If you have it in a very small degree, it can actually be helpful in a creative, which is the so-called inverted U function, where
Exactly.
there's a Goldilocks zone of whatever our characteristic. If you have too much of it, you're going to go crazy and not going to do anything. If you have too little, you're not going to be very creative. But there's this area, and that first degree relationship seems to support that. That was one of the takeaways when I read the book. Is that legitimate?
Yes. I mean, I think, again, it's an old hypothesis that it's, the reason we have continued to have mental illness is, and why has it not been weeded out through evolutionary principles? And it's because it serves some advantage. You need people who have looking at the world in different ways, bringing it, that they're not afraid to engage in other reality or think about things that might exist that are not clearly visible. And of course, when taken too far, I like to think about the way I was taught about a mental illness in when I was in India as an undergraduate. When they try to distinguish between then what we call neurosis and psychosis, they said, people who suffer from neurosis build castles in the air, and people who suffer from psychosis live in those castles, right? And so, but you have to imagine a castle, imagine living. It comes from a great imaginative capacity that, and you think about those capacities as well, they must have some function. And we all have the capacity to imagine. We all have the capacity to come up with alternative realities in our minds and so on. And in these particular cases, it's gone askew, gone too far. So the idea that there's a genetic component to it is long-standing and has some proof now in terms of there's some limited evidence, even directly linking creative abilities and certain genetic traits.
Mm.
But familial inheritance in history is then almost all professions, right? Like it's very hard to tease apart what's based on the genetics and what's based on the
Sure.
environment.
Sure.
Because if you grow up in a creative family full of creative professionals, it's not just their genes you have their environment, you have everything that comes with that package. And we have not a single study in the field of creativity that can dissociate these elements. So we don't have an equivalent of what happened with the Minnesota twins rear apart studies in the case of intelligence testing and so on and so forth. So we can't really tell. But we do know that it's in families. But seeing that more families are in the profession doesn't really prove from the Simone Kyaga studies that it's genetic. It certainly might suggest
Of
it.
course. Of course.
The bigger, I think, thing that comes from this is to try and figure out why it is they are in creative professions. Is it because they see the world differently, because they have an artistic temperament, because they're drawn to the aesthetic world or to the world of the imagination more than others? Or is it something about the conditions per se? And this we cannot tell apart. What came first, right? So we know, for instance, that creative professions tend to be sort of underappreciated unless you're in the most eminent category of creative achievement. Creative art, to be an artist is to struggle, is to not have full-time employment, is to not have a sort of nice, cushy social net, safety net to sort of fall back on and so on. And we saw this most readily in the time of COVID, most recently. The first group to be hit very hard were the artists, were they weren't able to practice. If you were an actress, well, too bad for you. You're not going to be able to act anymore in a theater and so on and so forth. So, and we know that those environmental conditions, those conditions of the world have a really huge impact on the way we feel, increase our stress. And those are all let's say, factors that contribute to mental illness. So this is where we're not sure. Is it about the precarity of the profession that leads to these states? Or is it something that they're endowed with? And certainly some, let's say, retrospective analysis of the Renaissance era suggests that we can't ignore the social cultural elements there and the precarity associated with most creative professions when we're talking about the mental illness creativity link. Because in the Renaissance period, where there was a lot of support for artists, you allegedly saw a lot less mental illness in artistic professions. So there's something there that we have to take note of when we're thinking about the mental illness creativity myth.
An important point you make is that in discussing the link between madness and creativity, you distinguish between states of madness, which is phasic in that they ebb and flow and they're momentary, which can be positively associated, from kind of traits of madness, which you call tonic, which that persist and are enduring and may be inhibitory towards creativity. So that's a critical distinction in terms of the nature of the madness.
Absolutely. And it's I think the least appreciated distinction that is made, because we're really looking at traits and making assumptions about state-based effects on creativity there.
Let's go on to 3, the psychedelic drugs and creativity. What's the myth?
The myth is that psychedelics improve creativity.
And the truth?
The truth is that it does not improve creativity in all participants. And it is very difficult to tell if it does because of the nature of the studies and the people who participate in such studies.
Yeah, I've always been a real skeptic of psychedelics in terms of giving deep insights into the nature of reality or into the fundamental spiritual nature of the mind and all of that. And, maybe I'm just a little bit behind the time, but in a sense, it's not a whole lot different that if you punch your eyeball, you'll see stars in a much more sophisticated, of course, way. So to me, the burden of proof is on the claims of a psychedelic experience.
Yes. I think definitely the burden of proof is on them. And it's hard to come up with that proof because it's almost impossible to run randomized control trials of psychedelics studies because, of course, when you're on it, because you're having the experience, and when you're not on it because you're not having that very intricate experience. But mainly one of the major problems is that it's very individual, what happens there. But my main approach in the chapter that I talk about is that I'm looking at why we think of them as linked. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence from those for whom it works. So most of the evidence is skewed based on the kind of stories we like to hear. And the stories that are produced about psychedelic experience and the amazing effect it has are so much more interesting than the stories of the people who have not had amazing insights.
Right. I'm very boring. I've not had it, and I can't tell good stories.
So that's something we need to recognize, that the proof we have is skewed. The second thing we need to recognize is when we do studies that look at psychedelics and its impact on creativity, we're very much dependent on who volunteers to participate in such studies. We can't force people. And the people who are open to taking, the only people you have are people who are open to taking psychedelic drugs, which is not the majority of the population.
Right, but that's already a skewed sample of reality.
Yeah, and guess what? The main reason is that it's kind of, even if you did find that psychedelic experiences lead to an increase in creativity, I don't think a single study so far has controlled for openness to experience, which is actually the really central personality trait that is critical for creativity. It's something, regardless of whether in the sciences, the arts, social domains, is singularly predictive of creativity, is openness to experience. And we know that people who are open to taking psychedelics and other forms of recreational drugs are also open to experience. So we need to have studies that not only try and tease these apart very carefully, but also that they also account for potential other factors that could explain it. way more. So that's another thing. Your sample is not only people who are happy to take drugs, but they also might be really open to experience and therefore more likely to be creative per se,
Right.
anyway.
Right.
And finally, though, the things that do excite me are the kind of work that look at uh, what aspects of creativity might be changed. And it's really looking at the people who are changed by the experience, even if it doesn't change everybody. Then the people who it is a huge effect, I think that's worth looking at. And then to think about what it is that it changes in them. But to assume that that is predictive and true of everybody is certainly not the case. But there are certain indirect effects that psychedelics could have, which is opening your mind to, making you less anxious, opening your mind to go outside your ecocentric space, and so on and so forth. That could indirectly feed into your creative potential and your creative drive. So there's some work that will show that. But certainly taking a psychedelic and hoping to write something amazing is not going to work. And people from Aldous Huxley on have said that for a very long time. The first people to experiment with the drug were eminent creatives themselves, and through a lot of self-study and openness, have told us a lot that we already in their time that we are only now starting to see in great, we now see bear out with experiments as well.
Good. Well, I'll remain a skeptic until we have more data. Let's go on to chapter 4, Atypical Brains and Creativity. It's fascinating. You deal with savants, the islands of genius, people who have generally distorted other mental capacities, sometimes on the autistic spectrum, but have incredible potential to do various kinds of things. And the question is, the things that they do, are they just pure prodigious memory or imitation, or are there genuine aspects of creativity? And how does this occur? The neuroplasticity of the brain is quite remarkable, as we know. So give some sense about the importance of studying savants and how it works.
It is a fascinating area. It's very understudied in terms of creativity per se. As you said, the memory aspect, prodigious memory abilities is what they're known for. And the question is whether this translates to creativity. And for a long time, it was thought of that this was not the case.
Okay, so by the way, I forgot the opening question. So that's the myth.
That's the myth, that it doesn't lead to creativity, or well, it depends on the disorder. So the thing is that a damaged brain can lead to incredible unleashing of abilities, some of which can be creative. That's the myth, yes.
Okay, and the truth?
And the truth is that that is not the case, but certainly what they are showing is a creativity of the brain, so to speak, in terms of the way in which they cope, interact with, deal with the world, and come up with their own ways of functioning.
And so to me, it sounds like neuroplasticity writ large. Examples of neuroplasticity, which always impressed me, are women who have taken thalidomide and then their children have no limbs. And I've seen cases of where a thalidomide baby with no arms and later got married and had a baby herself, would be able to take care of the baby with her feet.
Yeah.
And to do it almost at the level as if she had arms, which just is astonishing example of the neuroplasticity.
Yeah, the astonishing creativity of our physiology generally is what it attests to. And also I think that the work on savantism is really interesting in understanding, why do we create? So for a lot of these children, as they grow up into adults as well, they are very interested in what they do, and they pursue it, and they persist in it. They have this incredible drive. And the question is, if they don't show creativity, is it because they are not creative, or is it because they don't need to? They get so much enjoyment, fulfillment, and purpose from doing what they do, which is to hear someone else play and be able to reproduce it, or to engage in almost mental math or whatever it is. They get so much of I think almost an aesthetic experiences from just being able to reproduce. The question is, do because they don't, not all of them necessarily go on to develop creative abilities, does that mean that they can't, or that they don't feel the need to? So it tells you a lot, looking at savant syndrome and other types of atypical functionality. It tells us a lot about what people can do, what they're driven to do, what they're interested in. And that's what I hope to capture with that chapter. Because I, again, explore a range of different atypicalities there, and then look at also creative people who go through brain disorders. And what that really, really shows you is that, barring from when you're unable to move at all, creative people go on to create, even despite all of their incapacities and mental insufficiencies. And there's so many wonderful studies, first person narratives, case studies. We look at people across creative domains. And what I think stands out is not, their productivity is a little reduced, they're making different works. The fact that they're still making is astounding. It's easy to, with a little lesion in the brain, to knock out whole functions. It seems very hard to knock out the drive to create. And if anything, I wanted to end that chapter with was we have very little appreciation of how damage resistant our creative capacity is. And it continues with us throughout our lifetimes, all the way till through old age, whether we're going to age healthily or unhealthily. But it's there, and it doesn't seem to be as affected as other cognitive capacities are by the aging process, for instance. So that is something I think we still do not come to terms with in terms of understanding atypicality. Not that it's less or more, but the fact that it's still there, and it tells us so much about the creative spirit and our drive to be creative.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Let's go on to chapter 5, intelligence and creativity. And this is an area that has been, as you say, a very divisive, intelligence in general and its relationship to genetics or environment in many respects. But let's talk about its relationship to creativity. So what's the myth?
The myth is that intelligence and creativity are positively correlated.
And the truth?
The truth is that it is not. And that it's a much more nuanced relationship between the two.
Okay. So just give a very brief overview of this linking between intelligence, or IQ, as it sometimes is utilized in a specific way, and that's very controversial, and creativity.
Creativity research began from intelligence research. So the first creativity researchers were, at least in the modern era, were the ones who had a background in intelligence testing. So it's been tied for reasons of, I suppose, philosophy or academic sort of background more than anything else. And the idea is that there is a positive relationship between creativity and intelligence. And people vary. There are conflicting views in terms of whether this is completely linear or not linear. And the dominant model is called the threshold hypothesis, is that creativity and intelligence, as measured by IQ, by the way, and we're talking about the G factor, general intelligence here, are correlated up to a certain threshold. And the threshold was in early times deemed, in the 50s and 60s, deemed to be 120, an IQ of 120. And then after that, they were no longer correlated. And the field is very mixed. There's a lot of evidence for and against the threshold hypothesis. And this is primarily because, as we've come to understand now, the measures of creativity that we use in order to assess creativity are very limited in terms of how well they capture creativity. In terms of intelligence, why it is constantly used is because it has very good psychometric properties. A lot of the intelligence tests have good reliability, have good validity, and so on and so forth, despite all of the obvious controversies that are associated with intelligence testing. The psychometric aspects of it are pretty solid. This is not true in the case of creativity. They follow the study of creativity very much like the study of intelligence, which is to assume that there's a sort of general factor for creativity. But we haven't been able to find such a general factor, really. There's no evidence to show it. And this was sort of pointed out even in the 50s. The person who launched the field of the modern era of creativity research was Joy Paul Guilford in his very famous 1950 address to the American Psychological Association, where he made a case for, intelligence should be looking at creativity. And he said that if we always follow on to think that creativity is associated with intelligence, we're going to be misled. He said that in 1950, but it didn't matter. It just keeps being thrown up there as the thing to look for. And again, it's because it's seen very much as something that comes out of being intelligent or is in some tangential way related to it. And we can't say that it's unrelated, but if we're looking at G factor, it depends, of course, on what aspects of intelligence we're looking at. If we're looking at the G factors, the best studied aspect of intelligence um, as a concept, and the one for which we have measures, if you just correlate that with anything in creativity research, you don't find anything consistent. And that's the real problem. It matters what kind of creativity task, again, what the threshold is, what the measures we're looking at, and so on.
You quote Jacob Getzels and Philip Jackson. I'm going to get into what they said and get your comment on it. But the first comment I want to make is that Jacob Getzels is the father of Peter Getzels, who is Close to the Truth co-creator and producer-director and my partner. So I want to give credit to Peter's father, Jacob. Some of the work that they did, and as everything else is controversial, is that the results of their study that people can be gifted, and especially at that time, not only in terms of intellectual ability, but also in other dimensions. And creativity was one of them. Psychological adjustment, morality were also mentioned. How did that study fit into the development of the creativity intelligence nexus?
Yeah, I think it was the first to systematically really distinguish between gifted in terms of intelligence and gifted in terms of creativity, and broke them apart. The only thing I think that was lacking there was that they didn't have another group that was both creatively gifted and intelligently gifted. But they sort of wanted to really examine it in a lot of detail in terms of understanding their school experiences, how the teachers thought about them, how they thought about their own futures. It wasn't just looking at did they do well in school. What they found out was that both groups perform incredibly well academically, but they're regarded very differently by the people who supervise them, namely their teachers, and they had a very different notion about whether their skills would lead them somewhere, would be prized or would be valuable in the future. So the kids who were creatively gifted performed very well, but were seen as troublemakers and were not rated very well by their teachers because, of course, they have all sorts of ideas of their own, and they tend to be a little bit disruptive, or at least seen as disruptive, because they don't fall in line. Whereas the kids who are high in terms of their IQ tend to be model citizens of the classroom. What really struck me was that the creative kids were saying, "Yeah, I don't think I have the things that will allow me to make it in life later." And I think they had a lot of ego strength to be who they are, but they seemed to think that it didn't matter that they were highly creative. That wouldn't get them very far in the world later on, even though they were performing academically well.
Yeah. Part of the problem is that intelligence, we think, is relatively a simple factor to discern by the kinds of objective psychometric tests that have been established, whereas creativity doesn't have those same type of standards and benchmarks in which to assess it. And that's very difficult. So right at its core, methodologically, it becomes very tricky.
Correct.
Chapter 6, dopamine and creativity. Dopamine being a neurotransmitter, neuromodulator. Let's start by describing very quickly what a neurotransmitter and neuromodulator is and how many there are. I don't know if they're even countable, but many hundreds probably.
Yeah, there are many hundreds. Neurotransmitters are essentially the signal that neurons use to communicate with one another. And neuromodulatory neurotransmitters are those that have an impact beyond the individual neurons that they work between.
A broader rather
effect
than just across the synapse from one neuron to another. Okay, so what's the myth about dopamine?
That dopamine improves creativity.
Yeah, and the truth?
We don't know yet, and that's not very clear that it does so in a direct manner.
Okay. So why did this deserve an equivalent chapter to right brain or madness or intelligence, which are major kinds of ideas related to creativity, myth or not? But dopamine seemed to be a very small thing to me that had it sort of more isolated. So why did it deserve a full chapter?
I think because I'm looking at the today that we live in, and when we talk about how the brain is talked about, dopamine is talked about a lot in the public, whether it's through the media, through podcasts, and so on. There's just a lot of focus on what dopamine can do, and even in normal conversation with non-neuroscientists, people will talk about needing that dopamine hit and so on. So I thought that this is really ubiquitous idea, seemingly, of what dopamine is, and it's the ubiquitous idea is that it is related to reward, and that's good, and that you need to be putting it in a framework such that you get those hits, and you have to be worried about exposing yourself to things that give you too much of a hit, whether it's, I don't know, porn or too much junk food or whatever, because it's the same hit and so on. So there's a lot of focus on dopamine.
Yeah, and I use dopamine as a sort of a symbol of all kinds, because there are other neurotransmitters or neuromodulators that also have potential similar kinds of effects. So it's the question: does one or a series of them in some combination have this positive effect, and can you possibly, if so, intervene and give, which I would think would be very dangerous and unethical.
I would agree. And the hypothesis for that is essentially there, and it comes from little, in relation to creativity, comes from little strands of information that get, again, generalized in terms of what dopamine is for creativity. Now, they noticed, for instance, that when patients with Parkinson's disease were given dopamine agonists, a certain subset of them just started to develop creative behaviors. So that's usually the first starting point of, oh, there's something happening here that innervates the system that allows you to decide to become more creative as opposed to something else. What they found is that it also leads to other types of compulsive behaviors. But the thing, this doesn't get focused on in any article in creativity. They really focus on the creative outputs there. So that link was established. They became, dopamine has become sort of like a fill-in word for reward. And so any study that looked at the effect of rewards on creativity in terms of improving performance and so on seemed to argue in favor of, at least were stimulated or had at this background something in terms of the dopamine function. And there's a lot of work out there that shows the effects of dopamine in terms of problem solving, the flexibility versus feeling rigid and so on and so forth, and problem solving in terms of how it works on your prefrontal systems or your striatal systems. So because a lot of creative thinking is based on problem solving literature, examines things like frontal striatal function, one way to look at it is to look at not the brain systems in place, but in terms of structures and networks, but to look at the neurotransmitters in place. And in terms of creativity, the only one that gets any airtime is dopamine. And so I wanted to explore it primarily because I hear it being talked around a lot. And I thought it was necessary to pick up on myths that are myths in the making, in a sense, that are going to be big or starting to sound very big for our time. I'm sure that the people who are doing the right brain kind of myth kind of work didn't maybe know right at the moment it was starting that was going to become the biggest myth truth to deal with, right? So, and it took me down a lot of different paths to understand how dopamine is viewed. And in terms of creativity, what I can say was very interesting for me to discover is that it's not really about reward, because it's activated in so many conditions that are actually very the opposite of reward. Yeah, they're harmful, they're detrimental. So other hypotheses for dopamine, like salience and so on, started to grab my attention more. It's talked about a lot in the creativity context, in the context of openness to experience. We've talked about the sense of adventurousness, to go out and be attracted to new things in the world. That is also has a dopamine hypothesis behind it. And it made me understand that this dopamine really explains a lot about our unique and individual relationship with our creativity. So what is meaningful to you versus what's meaningful to me is driven by the system. So it's not so much about reward. Of course, something meaningful to you is rewarding in some sense, but it's really the meaningfulness. So it's somehow tied to our unique perspectives and the manner in which we engage in the activities that drive
An
us.
important conclusion of the chapter is that when you're trying to build a relationship between a neurotransmitter or modulator and creativity as an end result, it's not a direct line. There are these intermediary things that would lead to it, such as arousal or reward or satisfaction or risk reward tolerance, or who knows, a whole series of things that are sort of hidden intermediaries. So if you're just looking at a neurotransmitter and creativity, that would be a mistake.
Correct. Exactly. And it's much more to think about. We find it very hard to talk about indirect pathways, indirect concepts that we need to be coming to terms with. And as I explored that literature, I thought this is very rich because it ties in with what makes some of us, more creative than others, what makes some of us more resilient, more going down specific routes than others. It's because of our meaning making capacity, because of our drive. And all of that is fundamentally neurochemical.
Yeah, and the relationship between the impact of neurochemicals and the result actually reminded me of a study a long time ago that I read where hypnosis could increase the amount of weight lifted by an amateur, but not by a professional, because that professional will have already developed through other means the maximization on their body of their capacity, but an amateur would not have. So I think the condition of the target who is being creative is also an important aspect to how effective some of these things could be.
Absolutely. It's always about where are you in your set. So the dopamine studies have shown us that as well. When you give dopamine agonists to people and ask them to come up with, for instance, a motor generation task, um, you see that what matters really is how motivated they are. What is their baseline creativity?
Yeah.
What is their baseline level of motivation? And if they're already quite high, you can actually knock out the system rather than abet it. Whereas if you're quite low, that will give you a push up. This is true for a lot of drug-based studies, that it really matters what your baseline, even psychedelics, it really matters what your baseline
Makes
level
sense.
is.
Last chapter, chapter 7, the default mode network and creativity, which you call a myth in the making. First of all, what is a default mode network?
It's the network of brain regions that are active even when you're not doing anything, when you're resting.
Okay, what's the myth?
The myth is that it is positively correlated with creativity.
And the truth?
Many, many networks, not just the default mode network, are involved in creativity.
Yeah. And so how legitimate is using functional neuroimaging, show how it works, that what you have is you expect task-related increases, but now there's an unexpected task-related decreases, which somehow relates to the default mode network.
Yeah, that's how they found out about the default mode network. But in creativity studies, what they're looking at is just assessing brain activity patterns when you're not doing anything and correlating it with behavioral indices of creativity outside the scanner.
And what do you find?
Well, they find like specific areas of the default mode network might be related to behavioral performance. The problem is a lot of these studies have the problem of brain-wide association studies, which means that new papers have come out to show that you need hundreds of about 2,000 people in order to come to terms with exactly to be sure that those correlations are valid or legitimate. And the order of participants in the kind of studies that you see here are very, very low, in maybe 100 if you're lucky. So that's one of the problems, of just technical problems of doing this kind of study. When you look at things, when you try to correlate a behavioral measure with something that a brain measure, because the behavioral measures are pretty poor, it leads to you can see significant things that are not significant. And so you need to have added technical controls there. In the case of creativity, it's even more of a problem because you're looking at rest, you're asking people to do something creative and you leave, and you don't really ask the person to judge their own creativity. Somebody else is judging your creativity. So I could have had a creative moment at the scanner, but you might think that it's not. And so it's seen as low creative. So there's a lot of just invalidity issues there. And mainly the problem is that the resting state stuff that pushes the default mode brain network hypothesis doesn't correspond to the cognitive function type of studies where, you put someone in a scanner, you get them to do a task and you assess their brain activity while they're doing a creative task. There's not much correspondence between the findings in the rest of the resting brain compared to the cognitive function network studies.
Mm.
So that's the real divide there.
I always worry that in these large studies, even if you have 2,000 to make it statistically valid, that you are confounding different modes because something might be positively corresponding with one set of individuals and negatively with another. You put them together, you have zero correlation. But in fact, if you could tease them apart, you would see
Yeah.
two bimodal activities which are very different related to the base state or the neuroanatomy of the individual. So I think.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I would say I've argued this many times in several things that I've written, that it's not legitimate to argue for a whole network when you only see one area in that network activated. So you see one area and they'd say it's the whole network. So it's not like you consistently see all 5 areas activated to the same extent and so on. So there's just lots of methodological problems with not just creativity research, but a lot of research in general. And it serves as a cautionary tale when we, it again sounds great. The default, our capacity to imagine and be at rest and wander off must be related to creativity. So it's a great story, but it doesn't really correspond with a lot of the work when you look at the neuropsychological work that we've done with patients. Anything to do with cognitive function-based studies using EEG or fMRI, looking at creative responses in the scanner in real time, and so on.
Yeah, let's just discuss very briefly what I would call an overhang on everything we're talking about. In fact, everything in psychological and neuroimaging studies in general, the replication crisis, the failure to corroborate consequential studies that are published that are assumed to be true. And, the number I remember is like 40% of studies in psychology or even drug work has not been reproducible, which is, obviously a very serious charge. And people are now sensitive to that. But that really overhangs everything that we're talking about.
It certainly does.
And also, what about confirmation bias? I see that in myself when I read news, and I want to see Ukraine win, and so I look for articles that show that they're doing something positive, and avoid the articles that show that Russia is winning.
Yeah, I mean, it's always been a problem in research, and it's just sort of on a problem on steroids now because of how we get our information, how our how our channels of where we get our news or get our information from are curated. It's basically sculpted to fit with what we want to hear. And so the problem of confirmation bias is exacerbated infinitely, perhaps. And so it's a reason for all of these myths in the first place. Is that
good point? Good point.
Yeah.
You make a very grand statement, which I think subsumes the entire book in the way of thinking, that we need to embrace the gray zone, which is always uncomfortable, of the complex unknown over conveniently simple narratives, which I think all the myths are.
Yes, and I hope I've made a case for that in the book, because I tried to say that when we dig deeper into the stories are much more interesting because it's of the gray zone. We shouldn't, appease our sense of wanting to know what's right or wrong, because we've lived long enough in our lives to know that the truth is always a little more nuanced and deeper and thicker than that. And so, really, to try and derive pleasure from understanding the fullness and depth of a story, no matter how complex it is, or no matter whether it's your guy winning or not, is actually our purpose when we come to stories. Is that we have the cognitive capacities and the emotional wiring to do this, and we should.
Yeah, that's great. I just want to ask you about the very last sentence in the book, which was slightly enigmatic to me. And here's the sentence. I'm going to read it, and then you will give your exposition. It may be the poetic truth, but what about the larger truth?
Yeah. What I mean by that was I've taken those words from Glenn Lowry. We love the poetic truths, right? When we see the underdog win and so on, there's something poetic about it, the poetic justice of our hearts. We're a species that believes in, fairness and competition. And when things happen that feel right, when someone's going through a bad time and they suddenly come out of it and good things happen, we feel joy, we feel good about it. And when the bad guy gets his comeuppance, we feel joy at that too. So there's something here a sense of poetic justice we have in our heads that really prime us to looking at stories in a particular way, going down narratives in a particular way, to look at what's black and white, what's yes and no, who's good and bad, who's the hero, who's the villain. And that's what I mean by maybe the poetic truth. It might be the poetic truth to say, yes, the right brain is the seat of creativity and the left brain is not. That's a seat of control, because it feels like a poetic truth. But the question we need to ask is, but what's the larger truth? What's beyond that? And that's why I ended the book that way, because there is a larger truth beyond the poetic truth. The poetic truth is there to cater to our story-loving, storytelling instinct. But there's always a larger, the story is always curated, is always what the author wants you to know. And that's something, if we have that in mind, we might be able to, at least for a moment, keep ourselves in the gray zone.
Okay, it's really great. Thoroughly enjoyed the book. So now we're going to do some short questions, and we want, a few word answers, and whatever they are. So number one, what are some traits of creative people?
Openness, drive, tolerance of ambiguity.
Two, what are some methods or techniques to enhance creativity?
Perseverance, practice, self-belief.
What's the simplest technique to enhance creativity?
Daily practice.
How do you assess creativity in animals?
In animals, you'd look at anything that involves novel problem solving, novelty, or something different from their usual repertoire.
Okay, the next question, it's going to be a little bit personal, so I apologize. Would you take psychedelics to enhance your creativity?
Yes.
Okay. Can AI ever be creative as we are creative?
Can be creative, but not as we are.
Do you ever encounter ESP or parapsychology in your work on creativity?
I was at a parapsychology conference last week. Yes.
Wow, that's very astounding to admit on.
Well, it was a meeting of neuroscientists and parapsychologists in Portugal.
Okay. Well, we have to come back and talk about that. And finally, what are the dangers of creativity?
The danger is, because it's about reaching your potential, you may not care whether it's for the good of the world or not. It's for you.
Many thanks, Anna. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a terrific book. I recommend it to everyone. It is designed to give a way of thinking as well as answering specific questions about creativity and their myths. The way of thinking is particularly important. Viewers can watch over 1,000 Closer to Truth videos and dozens of TV episodes on consciousness on the Closer to Truth website and Closer to Truth YouTube channel. All facets of consciousness, the mysteries of what consciousness really is, brain function, free will, personal identity, creativity we deal with, panpsychism, dualism, idealism, parapsychology, life after death, cosmic consciousness, all, however, infused with critical thinking, which is what Anna's book, The Creative Brain, is all about. Thanks, everyone, for watching. Thanks again, Anna. I loved it.
Thank you, Robert. I'm so glad to be here and delighted that you asked me. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and comment below. You can support Closer to Truth by subscribing.